We are at the end of these lectures about writing. The content for this lecture comes from Brett C. McAnally and Dennis R. Perry's Writing and Rhetoric, Robert H. Woodward's The Craft of Prose, as well as selected readings from Martin Luther King Jr., Allan Planz, Lu Xun, and Benjamin Franklin. Today's lecture will be about how to use emotion in your writing. Before we jump into how to apply emotion into writing, however, we need to go back in time to ancient Greece and learn about three core concepts in writing: ethos, logos, and pathos. If you want to persuade people to believe you or believe your writing, you are required to have what is known as proof of evidence. When presenting proof or evidence, you can use one of three types of evidence: primary documents, secondary documents, or personal experience. When I say documents, however, while I do mean documents, as in paper or physical objects, I also mean something else. I have another lecture on the importance of primary documents that I would encourage you to watch if you can or have the time. It is much shorter than my writing lectures, so I will briefly summarize here the contents of that lecture. Primary documents are essentially at their core the personal experience or personal creation of people. Secondary documents, therefore, are the commentary of primary documents without reference to the personal experience of the writer. As you can imagine in nonfiction narrative writing, sometimes this can get complicated, and the two can become blurred. This leads to the third type of evidence, that being the writer's own personal experience when writing an essay, which utilizes both primary and secondary documents, which narrative nonfiction often utilizes. As I said, evidence is necessary to persuade your reader. If you do not persuade your reader, then your reader will remain disconnected from you, and your reader will become disinterested in your writing. And eventually, your reader will either forget your writing or will not finish your writing. But persuasion is more than skin deep. In fact, the art of persuasion goes much further below the surface into a basic human instinct known as credibility. According to Aristotle, the proof, or also known as the means of persuasion, is composed of three smaller proofs: ethos, logos, and pathos. Understanding these three concepts is integral to your ability as a writer in creating and maintaining credibility. Credibility is a complicated idea and must be built slowly. However, credibility can be lost in an instant. That's why it's important to clearly understand these three terms and how they interact with one another. Let's first talk about ethos. The controlling factor in persuasion is ethos. Ethos is a persuasive strategy built on trust. And you may be familiar with this word because it is related to the word ethics. Ethics is related to the idea of right and wrong. Is it right to do something? When is doing something or not doing something wrong? How do you avoid wrong behavior and pursue right behavior? This is the meaning of ethics. Therefore, ethics is the personification therefore, ethos is the personification of ethics within a person, such as yourself or the writer. Aristotle said that one's character is the controlling factor in persuasion. That is, how one is perceived by others is the controlling factor in persuasion. By controlling factor, he doesn't mean just that it's important. As a controlling factor, having positive or negative character is the power switch. Without character, someone will not even turn the power on. They won't even pick up your book or essay. They will just walk away from you. If they consider you to be an unethical person, they may disregard you, disregard your work. And if they are forced to read your work for school, as an example, they will already begin with an unfavorable impression of you, which will taint or color everything you do. Establishing credibility is a tricky business. You must be knowledgeable and know many things. And the things you know must be correct in how that information is communicated. You must be skilled in your writing ability, which takes practice and failure. You must be a reliable source of information in the area which you are trying to disseminate information. In other words, you must be consistent with your ideas, consistent with your content, and consistent with your timeline. To some degree, culturally, there will be variance in establishing credibility. Some cultures might establish credibility if you have a fancy degree from a fancy school, while other cultures may lower your credibility if you have that same fancy degree from that particular school. Your ideas might make you credible to one group, but make you untrustworthy to another group. So it is almost impossible to have universal credibility. Your ethos is also dynamic, changing as you change. However, the key point when talking about credibility is in writing, as a writer or researcher, you must provide evidence from experts and authorities. As a nonfiction writer, you should be gifting your reader with quotes, paraphrases, or summaries from experts. You should be providing references to other credible sources, other scholars, writers, and thinkers who are trustworthy, credible, and also maintain good ethics to boost your own ethos. Writing a paper with few references will always lead the reader to distrust your own work and may lead your reader to suspect you of plagiarizing the content of another source. At the very least, you should mention in your writing or at the beginning or end of your writing where your information came from to prevent your reader from assuming you must have plagiarized or stolen your ideas from other sources. So, how do you establish ethos? First, be brave. You establish yourself by being a person of character. Your reader must know you and must trust you. You must communicate the wholeness of yourself to your reader, or your reader will assume you are fake. Or when your reader discovers the truth about you, then the reader will feel ashamed of you and will not want to be associated with you anymore. Here are some questions for you to consider about yourself when thinking about how to establish your own ethos. Think about other writers you have read or who you admire. What is that writer's reputation? How was that writer's reputation established? How long did it take for that writer to establish his or her standing in the community? Sometimes it can take 20 years of hard work to establish a strong standing. And sometimes strong standing surprises a writer and happens immediately, although not usually. What kind of standing do you want in your community? Do you want other people to trust you? Do you want to be well known in your community? What are you willing to do to get that standing? We can also think of standing as reputation. What kind of reputation do you want? What are you willing to sacrifice for that reputation? Consider the positions of other writers you enjoy reading or thinking about. What do those people do for a living? Is he or she a teacher? Or are they working in a professional field? How long did it take for that writer to achieve that kind of position? What sacrifices did he or she have to make? Now, what about you? What kind of position do you want? Do you want a respectable position in your field? Do you want a high position with a high salary? Do you want a position where other people listen to and respect your ideas? Do you want a position of leadership? Or do you want a position of support? Secondly, develop your voice. Writers have authoritative voices. When they speak or write, the writer communicates big issues to readers and changes perceptions and values. It's not only important to know all the information, but it's also important to sound like you know all the information. Your reader might question you, and this is natural, but your reader should at least recognize that you believe what you are saying. Do you have something you believe in? Have you really taken the time to think about what you believe? If you haven't, don't worry. Most people haven't thought about the things they believe in until someone challenges them, and suddenly they are faced with making difficult decisions. Once you know what you do believe in, however, you must also develop an authoritative voice that communicates those ideas in big ways to your reader. You must be unapologetic in how you communicate with your reader. You must be the lone voice in the wilderness. You must be the man on the mountaintop. And you must be the zeitgeist of your own world. You can also use what is known as voice merging, or transfer the authority of the authors, writers, or thinkers you are citing or referencing in your own writing into your own voice. If you have voice merged correctly, then the power of that authority will merge with your own voice and create an even more powerful voice. However, if you have misunderstood the voice that you are attempting to merge, sometimes this will result in cataclysmic failure and will ruin your credibility. So I don't recommend doing this unless you are sure of the intentions of the voice you are attempting to merge with. Voice merging is helpful if you understand another writer or source very well and wish to emulate some of the power of that message in your essay. However, if you don't understand the message that writer is trying to communicate, I would try to remain objective when discussing their work, while also using your own voice in parallel. Sometimes a harmony of voices can even be more beautiful than a singular melody in a piece of writing. Third, try your best to identify with your reader. Do you even know who your reader is? Who are you writing to? One of the first mistakes all writers make is not writing to a particular audience. You can't write to everyone. Even best-selling authors have an audience. People who love Stephen King love horror and thriller books. People who love Stephen Covey love self-help books. Those authors both have written bestsellers, but their books are written for different audiences. Who is your audience? The values you present in your essay or writing must be in line with the values of your community. If the values are not in alignment, then your community will not read your work. If you are trying to change values in a community, then you must do so gently and in acknowledgement of the values already present in the community. Otherwise, you will either ostracize that audience, or you will alienate yourself from the people you want to read your writing. You must also speak the same language as that community. I don't just mean language like English, French, German, Japanese, Chinese, and so on. By language, I mean the things underneath the words we speak, the shared experiences, shared characteristics, and shared history. of a community. Now, let's move into a discussion about the second proof term, logos. In the previous lecture, we discussed at length the concept of logic and how to integrate argument into your writing. So for this lecture, I won't dive too deep into logic, but I did want to present three concepts that operate in tandem with establishing proof: critical thinking, critical literacy, and cultural literacy. These disciplines of the mind are key to understanding the Greek concept known as logos, or when translated to English, word, thought, reason, or order. Logos is more than just argument. It is argument through reason. Logos serves as the backbone of argument and the skeleton for all other aspects of successful academic writing. By academic writing, of course, I don't only mean writing done for the academy. The academy is also another Greek term and doesn't just mean school, but rather for the institution of learning in which learners slowly approach conclusions while evaluating evidence until a preponderance of evidence convinces the student that one or more of the conclusions are true. This is the attitude and personality of the academician, the scientist, the philosopher, and the rhetorician, or educated communicator. The art of writing is intimately linked to the art of rhetoric, which brings us back to these three concepts that operate in tandem: critical thinking, critical literacy, and cultural literacy. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking, according to Brett C. McAnally and Dennis R. Perry, is the ability to judge for ourselves the rightness of a claim based on available evidence. According to these two scholars, it is only through informed and reasonable arguing, or the presentation of arguments, not yelling at people or getting into fights, that we recognize truths that would otherwise go unnoticed. Logos, therefore, as arguing through reason, is the vehicle which we use to insert arguments into our writing. Therefore, while ethos is the writer's credibility as a person or character, logos represents the credibility of the writer's argument. How do you develop sustainable arguments, though? You can only develop informed and reasonable arguments if you understand what is being argued. And you can only understand what is being argued if you have taken the time to deconstruct the complexity into smaller pieces. Deconstruction occurs through three phases. Firstly, separation. Secondly, identification. Thirdly, reformation. To properly deconstruct an idea, you must first separate the idea into distinct pieces, which together compose the idea. Then you must identify what each of those pieces are and how they operate together. And finally, you must put all those pieces back together, piece by piece, so that you understand how the pieces interlock with each other, how they relate to one another when put back together, and how they function in harmony or disharmony with one another. Being able to critically assess an idea is necessary to developing a credible logos. What about critical literacy? Critical literacy is the ability to question or explore what is believed to be true, and to challenge or dispute claims and opinions of others in an attempt to clarify and understand, according to McAnally and Perry. Many people misunderstand critical literacy, and they believe that the academy should not teach learners to be critically literate. Many believe that teaching critical literacy is forcing students to question their basic assumptions and traditions. This could not be further from the truth. While critical literacy does contain the element of questioning tradition, the goal of critical literacy is not to question tradition. Instead, the goal of critical literacy is to develop the faculties of, number one, recognizing values in a society, community, or organization. Number two, evaluating how those values are believed and to what extent. And number three, applying appropriate modes of challenge or disputation. Today, many academies fail in one of these three. Sometimes academies fail to recognize the actual values in a society and create a cognitive bias loop in which certain values are taught, but others are not recognized as being valid. Sometimes academies fail to evaluate the importance or strength of certain values, limiting the educational value of the institution. And sometimes academies fail to appropriately apply challenges or disputations by forcing linearity of thought on students through punishment mechanisms, such as forced observance or intellectual exile. Therefore, the goal of critical literacy should be to avoid these pitfalls. Rather, create the skills necessary for raising awareness of baseline societal values. Finally, the final concept necessary in establishing logos is cultural literacy. What is cultural literacy and how is it different from critical literacy? Cultural literacy is different in specificity, while critical literacy is learning to recognize failures inherent in society, community, or organizations. Cultural literacy is a specific knowledge of techniques used within the realm of intelligentsia, the educated or the credentialed. The saying ivory tower often refers to those with a great deal of education, and it should not be ignored that these people who live in this ivory tower often see themselves above others, as they consider themselves to live purely within the realm of ideas. Whether for good or ill, cultural literacy is your ability to communicate within this field. Your skill sets, whether they be how to conduct yourself at an academic conference, how to apply for a grant, how to prepare an article for publication in a journal, how to conduct oneself inside a classroom, how to consult with professors or researchers on a topic, how to perform a peer review, how to properly cite a reference in a research paper, how to construct a bibliography or annotated bibliography, or basic knowledge in the body of scholarship that is most relevant in your specific field. These are the components of cultural literacy. The culture of cultural literacy is specific to your particular educational culture. And these can differ by region, country, or even type of institution. Schools for children, for example, exhibit an entirely different type of cultural literacy than schools for young adults or schools for adults. Graduate programs are not the same as high schools or even undergraduate universities. Different technical fields will have different degrees of cultural literacy. For example, which format should you write in? MLA, APA, Chicago, or a different style? Staying up to date on your specific style can also be important. For example, currently Turabian, which is a derivative of Chicago, is already in its 9th edition. The 9th edition is different from the 8th edition. And can hardly be compared to the first edition. Such a comparison might seem like comparing apples and oranges. These three aspects, critical thinking, critical literacy, and cultural literacy, are the pillars to your logical credibility when you are writing, and you must seriously develop your critical thinking skills, your critical literacy abilities, and your cultural literacy knowledge if you wish to remain a credible source of knowledge when writing. Now, finally, let's move the discussion into pathos, where we will remain for the rest of the lecture. The bulk of this final lecture will be about how to incorporate emotion into language. To discuss this complicated subject, I will divide this third part of the lecture into two additional sections. First, we will talk about the idea of pathos and how to incorporate direct emotion into an argument. Second, we will talk about the idea of satire and how to incorporate indirect emotion into an argument through the use of narrative. This is an important distinction between direct emotion and indirect emotion. And this is a distinction which we don't fully appreciate how it influences our writing. When I was in my 20s, I am currently in my 40s, after the painful ending of a particularly close romantic relationship, I wrote a short story over a period of several days, amounting to around 10,000 words. The images, the characters, the plot, even the way the words were arranged on the page, for years, I didn't understand what I had written. To most people, they couldn't understand the gravitas of the plot, the characterization, or even the violence displayed in each short chapter of the tale. I also did not understand what I had written. I had written these words in an absolute frenzy. My broken heart had translated into a discombobulated and broken set of dioramic musings, which even collected together seemed to form less than a coherent image. Years later, I look back on that mess of a story, and I can intimately understand each character, each strange behavior, even the naming conventions I used for people, places, and things. And I understand how that was directly related to the emotional struggle I was going through at the time. I can interpret the story like some might interpret a dream, to capture the essence of my chaotic and tempestuous feelings of betrayal, anger, resentment, hope, love, joy, and despair. I have never published this story and most likely never will, because the story is so raw that it feels less of a service to the reader and more to the service of myself. The reason I am telling you this is simple. Everything you write, whether you are writing a short story, a poem, a novel, or even an essay, could be a narrative essay like we are learning to write with these lectures, or it could be an academic essay on the relationship of a literary or historical figure to a particular political movement, or even a technical manual on the structure of a graphite protein. Everything you write carries within itself an emotional resonance that is directly tied to the author of those words. Whether you want that emotion to be carried in your words isn't really your choice. It's just a function of the way the brain translates thoughts into language. This is why when you learn a new language, your brain begins to have different feelings. And you start to react to people differently when speaking that language. This is why sometimes if you speak a different language, you appear to have an entirely different personality. It's not that difficult to understand. It's about the emotional resonance and emotional harmonics that language inherently carries. This is also why when you read a translated novel or poem, the emotional feeling from reading that poem is totally different. And the feelings you experience when reading seem to be in a different weight class altogether. So, what exactly is pathos? Pathos is literally the Greek word for emotion, although pathos is used in the strategy of rhetorical persuasion. Pathos is the strategy which communicators use to appeal to the audience's emotion. As I described before, your writing will always carry your own emotional resonance. So you need to be mindful of this reality as you are writing. But when you are writing something, you must also be mindful that your reader will also respond to your writing emotionally and personally. So your job as a writer is to appeal directly to your reader's emotion. Pathos comes from a similar set of words. For example, both empathy and sympathy are forms of pathos. Empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, while sympathy is the ability to wear someone else's shoes. The difference between these two are both tiny and giant. If you are empathetic, you are imagining that you are literally the other person experiencing something. If you are sympathetic, you are imagining that you yourself are going through the same experience as another person. Both are valid and powerful, and both are necessary to understand if you want to use pathos to your advantage in a piece of writing. According to Elliot Aronson in his 1972 book, The Social Animal, writing that is primarily emotion is more persuasive than writing that is primarily logical. Now, that is not to say that your writing shouldn't be logical, but that if your writing doesn't contain an emotional appeal, then when faced between another piece of writing that does carry emotional appeal, your writing will be objectively less persuasive if purely using logical appeal. According to McAnally and Perry, the intellect may be changed through a logical appeal, but behavior can only be changed through emotional appeal. Logic, when wearing the clothes of an emotional appeal, becomes that much stronger, and both the mind and behavior can be changed through this strategy. I'd like to read a portion of McAnally and Perry's book for you where they discuss Aristotle's book, The Art of Rhetoric. In his ancient treatise, Aristotle discusses anger and mildness, friendship and enmity, fear and boldness, shame and shamelessness, gratitude, pity and indignation, envy and emulation. Aristotle's use of these particular emotions in such an ancient work should both educate you of the strengths of using emotion in writing, as well as the dangers of using emotion in writing. Remember that Aristotle was very concerned with sophistry, or the use of communicative fallacies to deceive an audience or reader. Emotions are powerful tools. They can transform a piece of writing from a block of wood to a tear-jerking sculpture. When people experience fear, experience love, experience revulsion, experience hatred, they will also change their behavioral response to accept or reject certain inputs. Often, people, including you and me, will behave in irrational ways due to the powerful and potent aura of emotional resonance in something we are reading or watching. So first, a warning. Before I continue, let me be very clear about something. Using emotional appeals in unethical ways, that is, to deceive or trick your reader into accepting an unreasonable result that is not in his or her best interests, is unethical, and you should not do this. The fact that so many people do this already, watch any TikTok video today, that does not make it ethically correct or okay. It is not okay. When you use emotional appeals in your writing, you must be clear about your goals, clear about your intentions for your reader, and clear about who stands to gain what, who stands to lose what, and who stands to gain most. As I have explained before, abusing emotional appeals in writing is a short-term solution to long-term irrelevance. You and your work will be forgotten because your reader or audience will recognize your unethical behavior, and they will not pass on your work to the next generation. Your work will die in the cradle without even being taught how to walk, how to eat, or how to speak to a new generation. If you need evidence of this, go to a website like Project Gutenberg, which contains the archives of millions of books which are no longer in print, and compare those books which are no longer available with the popularity of those authors during their careers. Many, if not most of them, carry a huge corpus of work that is no longer available because they were using short-term emotional appeals to people of their generation. But behind those short-term emotional appeals, they lacked a significance of lasting impact for their writing. Authors who used emotional appeals for political purposes, racist purposes, or religious purposes, and not for the benefit of the reader, but rather for the benefit of a political party, economic class or caste of people in a society, or a religion. These works generally became forgotten as soon as that political party, caste, or religion were no longer a curiosity for consumption. Now that I've given you sufficient warning, let's talk about some strategies to infuse your writing with emotional appeal. When you use emotional appeal in your writing, you should place the appeal either near the beginning or near the end of a piece of writing. This is why in our series of lectures, I instructed you to use a hook at the beginning of a piece of writing. The hook is a great location in writing to place an emotional appeal for your reader. When you place your emotional appeal near the beginning of your essay, your reader will be predisposed to accept what you are going to write. This works both if the reader agrees or even disagrees with your argument. The reader will need resolution, or else the reader will forever be bothered by you as the writer. On the other hand, in my lecture known as the STAR, I taught you to place an element in your conclusion known as a call to action. In the call to action, this is also another wonderful location where you can place a secondary emotional appeal, as we have discussed today. The emotional appeal will often lead to behavioral change. So a call to action will result in the reader's behavior changing if an emotional appeal is coupled together with the call to action. So here are some specific strategies you can use during your placement of the emotional appeal. Firstly, use concrete examples. What do I mean by a concrete example? A concrete example is an example which uses narrative techniques such as character, setting, and imagery to accurately and not deceptively construct an example that will not change over time. Journalism is famous for misconstruing or abusing real-world examples for political or corporate purposes. If an example can be disproven, then the example is not concrete. However, if the example is owned by reality and is true, then the example is concrete. Furthermore, a concrete example is immediate. A concrete example is arresting for readers. For an example to be arresting, this means that when the reader encounters the example, he or she is stopped emotionally. The image is so troubling, so fantastic, so mesmerizing that automatically a story beat is formed in the brain. If A, then B. The reader seeks resolution to the image. The reader needs an answer to the problem the image portrays. If the example is not immediate, if the example is not arresting, if the example doesn't require a response, then the example is not a concrete example. Instead, the example will slip away in the tide to be swept out to sea because it has no emotional resonance. No one will care, and the example will be forgotten. I will read for you one of the most famous concrete examples from an essay written by Martin Luther King Jr. called "I Have a Dream." Most people know of this speech, but few have listened to the whole speech. I encourage you to review and study the speech to see how King uses emotional appeals to continually buffet his thesis. But in this specific part of his essay, he uses a concrete example, that being an example which succeeds with both requirements. Number one, the example is real and cannot be disproven. And number two, the example requires a response from the audience, listener, or reader. As you listen to this part of the speech, test yourself. Can you identify which example is the concrete example that Martin Luther King Jr. uses? We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating, "For whites only." We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Okay, so King uses many examples in this short part of his essay. He uses the example of police brutality, of segregated motels and hotels, of segregated schools, and of the ability and mobility to vote. But there is one example that King uses, which is concrete. That is, when he says, we can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating, "For whites only." The other examples King uses don't have a specific place in which they exist. But when he uses the specific example of a sign with actual words on the sign, his example gains emotional power. During King's speech, many people who heard his speech might not have been aware of the antagonism between the Black community and the police. If they were from a place like California, they may not have been aware that motels or hotels segregated someone by the color of their skin. If they lived in a protected community with strict laws against Blacks moving inside of their neighborhoods, they may not have been aware they had Black neighbors. And most people, not within the immediate community, would have even been aware of the conditions within either a small or a large ghetto. However, everyone in the country had seen the signs. The signs were posted everywhere, from New York to California. People had experienced the signs and those infamous words, "for whites only." Not only was this example an irrefutable reality, but this example demanded a response. Even today, this example continues to be a prescient and powerful image of pre-1960s America. And even today, this sign continues to demand a response. Even if you aren't American, you feel a sign like that demands a response. King did not use flowery language, sensory imagery, or even the elaborate wordplay he employs in other parts of his speech. He merely pointed out a concrete example. That is the power of a concrete example. While you can encourage a concrete example with the use of wordsmithing, a powerful and concrete example doesn't need that kind of language if it's an actual concrete example. It just is. Another method of creating emotional appeal is word choice. Now, this can get a little trickier because once you start using words to create emotional appeal, you risk using fallacies and you risk the danger of becoming a sophist and engaging in sophistry. Using vivid language has the power to create an emotional experience within the reader, but it carries the danger that the words will fall flat. The reader will begin to distrust you as the writer, or the words will actually succeed and bring your reader to a hyperbolic understanding that is untruthful and possibly cause great harm to your reader unconsciously. As we have discussed in a previous lecture, many words carry implied meaning. Richard Weaver, in his 1985 Ethics of Rhetoric, calls terms which carry powerful emotional overtones as God terms, for words with overly positive connotations, and devil terms, for words with overly negative connotations. Often these terms will differ according to country, region, or culture. A popular devil term today is the word Nazi, because of its association with the Nazi Party in mid-20th century Germany. For many Americans today, words like democracy, liberty, family, and prosperity are God terms. But it's important to understand that these words, as I explained before, over time change their meanings. And it's important that when using these kinds of words to create emotional resonance, you understand they carry only a short-term advantage to your long-term irrelevance. That is not to say you cannot use these words, but devil terms and God terms are dangerous words that must be used very carefully. However, used well, These terms can open your essay up to an entirely new or larger audience and increase your readership tenfold, hundredfold, even thousandfold. Word choice can also be related to the use of figurative language. Techniques such as metaphor, simile, analogy, allusion, imagery, hyperbole, understatement, personification, rhetorical questions, irony, and tone. These techniques are useful when generating emotional resonance because they alter and shift what is expected. For example, instead of describing an old tree to talk about the decaying forests of a small village, you could describe the tree like a haggard and withered old trunk, rotted with old squirrel holes, shuddering against an uncommonly cruel wind, unfettered by columns of haphazardly harvested fields. There is an emotional resonance in the use of figurative language, which implies, due to the neglect of the fields, that the wind can hammer across this old tree that has since fallen into disrepair, a tree that no longer has anyone caring for it and is slowly dying. Now, I'd like to read another example that illustrates the use of word choice in evoking an emotional appeal. This passage is a little long, but listen to the various ways the author, Allan Planz, uses words in new and unique ways to demand a response. While you are listening, which of the sentences or examples evokes the strongest feeling from you? On the west bank of a brown river, there is a place where the wildness of nature mingles savagely with the wildness of civilization. Bare rocks have shouldered the rain into a sunken meadow, and more than a dozen autobodies create a ring of metallic resonance around the small pond, from which all life, even the mosquito wriggler, has been choked by chemical stasis. Sunlight sickens on rust and purpled alloys, glints on the black water and shimmers on oil-stained sand. This was a watering place once, a ford, a concourse, and one of many thousands of departure points. Buffalo rested by the rocks, heads to the wind, and geese held back the encroaching swamp for centuries, until guns killed off the geese, and later gasoline killed the weeds. The erosion gully was a stream when lush grasses upcountry sifted the rain through their roots. Now every drizzle means sudden flood. Here, Indians made camp near the bank and watched the fire shape and shadow the waters. The pioneer paused to collect his forces for the plunge farther into the west on the trail which, under moonlight, stirred faintly above the dark. A family settled here and built a homestead, of which only a few rectangular depressions remain. This land was overgrazed, overfarmed, and abandoned, then assumed a civilized function as a dumping ground for vandalized car wrecks from the highway a mile off. Though doubtless title to it is jealously guarded, nobody possesses it now, nobody watches over it, and it is nameless. One can come across it hiking and descend the rocks to the black pond and rest among the junked cars and among the slaughtered beasts. Locusts skid in the sand or sing, entombed, in the sticky sludge spilled from crank cases. The river, with its machined flow, scours the pocked bank. The shadows inside and under the cars are bruises of blue air. Dust devils snake in the fine grit and whirl flakes of rusted metal. One may calculate and possess again all the miles he has traveled, all the cities and towns that he has called home, and that irresistibly erupted him back on the road. One may calculate all those whom money had bought or killed. One may do nothing wish nothing. If the hot breeze stirs, it brings only the hands of buried men, and bears no witness to the riposte of osprey and eagle above terraces of clear water. And the night comes on, upside down, gaining on the earth a darkness it never has in the sky. The air smells of heated iron, rancid oils, and of water thickened with sewage. Voices in the blood begin talking of the blood's cessation. One picks up a theme, then, of the splendor of empire weighted against the dust of the people who built it, and gives it to the heaviness of the night through which one has lived each night, getting drunk under stars arranged in patterns long since prefigured in the fears of men. And with the geophysics of the night in one hand, a bottle in the other, invokes that theme, so that when the dawn splays the broken figure of a man or beast on a hilltop, the wind may come again, if ever it comes again, singing not requiem, but revolution. The final strategy I'd like to discuss with you in this lecture is the use of satire. What is satire? Satire is a type of emotional persuasion where the writer will literally flip the script by using emotional appeal in reverse order. The writer of satire will describe a situation or event so that the situation or event becomes so ridiculous in the eyes of the reader that the reader notices the weaknesses of the situation. Satire presents very specific subjects: ideas, institutions, persons, or types of persons, with the goal of creating or changing an opinion of one or more of those four terms. Satire is best practiced within the confines of a particular culture or region where certain opinions are already held about specific ideas, institutions, persons, or types of persons. Satire is usually a response to a negative set of opinions that the writer wishes to change, and uses ridiculous and over-the-top, sometimes even fantastical circumstances to navigate the reader into a new realization. Satire can be both fiction and nonfiction. One of the best satirists who wrote both fiction and nonfiction was the author Lu Xun. In his most famous satire, The True Story of A.Q., Lu Xun describes the rise and fall of a man living in early 20th century China, and uses his deplorable situation as both an indictment of traditional Chinese culture, as well as an indictment to the current situation in China. I'd like to use this scene from The True Story of A.Q. to begin our discussion of satire, as this is one of the most powerful scenes of satire in literary history, as well as one of the most successful scenes of satire in terms of prompting a change in behavior in his readers after the publication of the story. This passage is from chapter 3, a further account of A.Q's victories, translated by Yang Tianyi and Gladys Yang, published originally in 1921. One spring, when A.Q. was walking along in a state of happy intoxication, he saw Whiskers Wang sitting stripped to the waist in the sunlight at the foot of the wall, catching lice. And at this sight, his own body began to itch. Since Whiskers Wang was scabby and bewhiskered, everybody called him Ringworm Whiskers Wang. Although A.Q. omitted the word ringworm, he had the greatest contempt for the man. To A.Q., while scabs were nothing to take exception to, such hairy cheeks were really too outlandish and could excite nothing but scorn. So Aku sat down by his side. Had it been any other idler, Aku would never have dared to sit down so casually. But what had he to fear by the side of Whiskers Wang? In fact, his willingness to sit down was doing the fellow an honor. Aku took off his tattered lined jacket and turned it inside out. But either because he had washed it recently or because he was too clumsy, a long search yielded only 3 or 4 lice. He saw that Whiskers Wang, on the other hand, was catching first one and then another in swift succession, cracking them between his teeth with a popping sound. Aku first felt disappointed, then resentful. The despicable Whiskers Wang had so many, he himself so few. What a great loss of face. He longed to find 1 or 2 big ones, but there were none. And when at last he managed to catch a middle-sized one, stuffed it fiercely between his thick lips, and hit hard, the resultant pop was again inferior to the noise made by Whiskers Wang. All Aku's ringworm patches turned scarlet. He flung his jacket on the ground, spat, and swore, "Hairy worm!" Okay, so let's analyze this passage from Lucian. Firstly, let me say, I am not an expert on Lucian, and neither am I an expert on Chinese culture, the distinct intellectual region in which this story takes place. Lucian's use of satire, however, is incredibly potent in this passage. Although a very simple story beat, 2 homeless beggars encounter one another on the road. Beggar A sits down and notices beggar B. Beggar A is embarrassed because beggar B looks more pitiable. Beggar A then tries to match or even exceed beggar B, but fails to become more pitiable. The result is that beggar A loses face and resolves that beggar B is now his enemy, because beggar B is a much better beggar. This operates on several levels. The first level is as an indictment and criticism of a failed city or state, which allows beggars described in the story to compete with one another rather than being held to higher standards. The second level is an indictment or criticism of a culture, which rather than pushing strong moral behavior through positive outcomes, seems to encourage strong immoral behavior because of a corrupted system of ancient morality long since having become a pale shadow of potentiality. The third level is an indictment or criticism of institutions which inhabit the potential for a person like Aku to be brought circumstantially so low as to be robbed of his own moral humanity. This is satire's power. Present a relatively simple situation, universally applicable, to critique a problem. Using reverse psychology, the reader plays a puzzle with his or her own mind and feels victorious once the solution cleverly arises from his or her own intellect. However, the emotional connectedness is more than important in satire. It is essential. For example, if Lucian wrote a story about 2 businessmen in a meeting with each other, and one businessman gave a better PowerPoint presentation than the other, causing a loss of face, the story would not have had the same emotional resonance. Aku's entire arc, from his downfall as a young, rich scion to his depravity in competing with another man in a game of cracking lice with his teeth, is not only a scathing criticism of 20th century China, but honestly, a scathing criticism of any country that suffers the humiliating degradation of homelessness and vagrancy. I'd like to show you another example of how satire can be used well in nonfiction. This example is from Benjamin Franklin, from his article, The Sale of the Hessians, which he published in 1778. At the time, a popular form of literature was the genre of the letter. Many books were even written in the forms of characters writing letters to each other as a way to move the plot forward. While we don't see many writers using this form today, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, this literary form was quite popular. I will read you this entire article so you can appreciate how Franklin was able to integrate satire fully into his argument. From the Count de Schönberg to the Baron Hohendorf, commanding the Hessian troops in America. Rome, February 18th, 1777. Monsieur le Baron, on my return from Naples, I received at Rome your letter of the 27th December of last year. I have learned with unspeakable pleasure the courage our troops exhibited at Trenton, and you cannot imagine my joy on being told that of the 1,950 Hessians engaged in the fight, but 345 escaped. There were just 1,605 men killed, and I cannot sufficiently commend your prudence in sending an exact list of the dead to my minister in London. This precaution was the more necessary, as the report sent to the English ministry does not give but 1,455 dead. This would make 483,450 florins instead of 643,500, which I am entitled to demand under our convention. You will comprehend the prejudice which such an error would work in my finances, and I do not doubt you will take the necessary pains to prove that Lord North's list is false and yours correct. The Court of London objects that there were 100 wounded, but ought not to be included in the list, nor paid for as dead. But I trust you will not overlook my instructions to you in quitting Castle, and that you will not have tried by human succor to recall the life of the unfortunates whose days could not be lengthened but by the loss of a leg or an arm. That would be making them a pernicious present, and I am sure they would rather die than live in a condition no longer fit for my service. I do not mean by this that you should assassinate them. We should be humane, my dear Baron, but you may insinuate to the surgeons with entire propriety that a crippled man is a reproach to their profession, and that there is no wiser course than to let every one of them die when he ceases to be fit to fight. I am about to send to you some new recruits. Don't economize them. Remember, glory before all things. Glory is true wealth. There is nothing degrades the soldier like the love of money. He must care only for the honor and reputation. But this reputation must be acquired in the midst of dangers. A battle gained without costing the conqueror any blood is an inglorious success, while the conquered cover themselves with glory by perishing with their arms in their hands. Do you remember that of the 300 Lacedaemonians who defended the defile of Thermopylae, not one returned? How happy should I be could I say the same of my brave Hessians? It is true that their king Leonidas perished with them, but things But things have changed, and it is no longer the custom for princes of the empire to go and fight in America for a cause with which they have no concern. And besides, to whom should they pay the 30 guineas per man if I did not stay in Europe to receive them? Then it is necessary also that I be ready to send recruits to replace the men you lose. For this purpose, I must return to Hesse. It is true, grown men are becoming scarce there, but I will send you boys. Besides, the scarcer the commodity, the higher the price. I am assured that the women and little girls have begun to till our lands, and they got on not badly. You did right to send back to Europe that Dr. Krumerus, who is so successful in curing dysentery. Don't bother with a man who is subject to looseness of the bowels. That disease makes bad soldiers. One coward will do more mischief in an engagement than 10 brave men will do good. Better that they burst in their barracks than fly in a battle and tarnish the glory of our arms. Besides, you know that they pay me as killed for all who die from disease. And I don't get a farthing for runaways. My trip to Italy, which has cost me enormously, makes it desirable that there should be a great mortality among them. You will therefore promise promotion to all who expose themselves. You will exhort them to seek glory in the midst of dangers. You will say to Major Mondorf that I am not at all content with his saving the 345 men who escaped the massacre of Trenton. Though the whole campaign, he has not had 10 men killed in consequence of his orders. Finally, let it be your principal object to prolong the war and avoid a decisive engagement on either side, for I have made arrangements for a grand Italian opera, and I do not wish to be obliged to give it up. Meanwhile, I pray God, my dear Baron de Hohendorf, to have you in his holy and gracious keeping. Benjamin Franklin's biting satire, while a fictional letter, uses real numbers, real facts, real situations, real events, and real people to expose the hypocrisy of the German barons who sold their own soldiers to Great Britain to fight against Americans during the Revolutionary War. One of the major reasons why Great Britain lost the war with America was because they used foreign mercenaries as a bulk of their fighting force. And the men fighting were not fighting for the crown, only for coin. While the men defending themselves fought for their own freedom, families, and their hearth and home. While Franklin's article is not as clever as Lucian's, nevertheless, it exposes the madness and insanity of the American Revolution, written not as a way to gin up support for the war in America, but as an invective against both the British and the Germans for the battle they waged across the seas. While this was clearly politically driven, due to Franklin's clever application of patriotic satire, not only does he not sound insipidly patriotic, he actually makes the case against war, if such were possible in a letter praising the virtues of war. In conclusion, the use of emotion in your writing can serve powerful purposes, but it must be done thoughtfully and carefully. All the examples given in this lecture demand a response. The first example from Martin Luther King Jr. demanded an end to the practices of segregation. The second example from Allan Planz demanded a more thoughtful approach to building cities and protecting the environment. The third example from Lucian demanded a reform of cultural and political institutions to bring his country out of poverty. And the final example from Benjamin Franklin demanded a recognition from Europe that sending foreign mercenaries to fight your wars was not to be tolerated. Emotion is a powerful tool when used in conjunction with writing nonfiction, especially narrative nonfiction. Always, however, keep your eye on the prize and don't take shortcuts that will remove the potential impact of your work. Take care with your examples and use figurative language to launch your writing into the next generation.